Well, I've got straight up 6 o'clock, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started. And I know there'll probably be a few more joining us, but I'd like to welcome everyone to our land management series. I am Richard Parrish. I'm the county extension agent in Leon County. And this land management series was kind of the idea of myself and the Freestone County extension agent, Aaron Davis. And you'll be hearing from Aaron here in just a little bit. And so this is the first one we've done, and we'd like to thank our regional program director, Brent Batchelor in Stephenville. We'd like to thank him for his efforts in getting the Zoom program set up. Before we get started, in the chat feature, I did put in a little message about a survey that through Texas A&M AgriLife Extension we are doing. We're trying to conduct a community needs assessment survey, identifying the strengths and weaknesses of our communities, called Texas Speaks. So I would encourage you to, after the program, to take a few moments to get on and complete the survey. Share that link with your friends and families, your neighbors, your enemies, whoever. Share it with everybody. Get the word out so we can get a pretty good representation of what's going on that's good in our communities and what are some areas that need improvement. Also, before we begin our program, I do want to make mention that we've begun plans for the second program in our series. So on April the 20th, I believe it is, we're going to have a program on lease agreements. What needs to be done in development of a lease agreement, writing a lease agreement, all the ins and outs, the do's and don'ts. So be looking for information on that. So that will be April 20th via the Zoom platform. Our speaker for that one will be Tiffany Lashmet, who is our extension legal specialist when it comes to ag issues. So we're excited to have that. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron Davis, and Aaron is going to introduce our first speaker. So Aaron, it's all yours.
All right. Well, thank you, Richard. Like he said, I'm Aaron Davis, the ag agent here in Freestone County. Thank you to everyone that is logged on with us today, and hopefully you follow us along the rest of this series and log on to the other topics that we have outlined for you. The first speaker that we're going to have, well, we actually have two guests from the Freestone County Appraisal District. We have our Chief Appraiser, Bud Black, and the Ag Appraiser, Jason Moore. So I believe Jason Moore is going to do the majority of speaking, and then Mr. Black will step in if there's any questions or anything like that. So Jason, over to you.
Good evening. My name is Jason Moore. I'm the Ag Appraiser here at Freestone Central Appraisal District. I'm going to get my screen shared here. One second. And I have a short PowerPoint presentation talking about the qualifications for property to receive agricultural or timber or wildlife valuation on people's properties. So, so first up, I'm going to go over the qualifications for agricultural valuation. For property to receive that, it must have a history of agricultural use for at least 5 out of the previous 7 years. And a couple ways to prove that. One is if you've acquired property that was already receiving the ag valuation, that takes care of the history requirement. If you have property that has not had the ag valuation already, we have a form called the history affidavit. And it's a form that you can take and have somebody fill out that is familiar with the property, that is not a family member. And they will just fill it out and say, yes, I'm familiar with this property. For however many years they've been doing this agricultural activity. And that would help to prove up the history of ag use on the property. Next requirement is that the primary use of the property is for agricultural purposes. What is typical around here is people buy a piece of property and they'll apply for ag, but anything considered, say, a home site, the primary use is going to be a residence. So, the land that the house sits on, and then what would be considered a front and backyard, wouldn't qualify, but then the rest would. The next qualification is we look at that the property is being used at an appropriate intensity. And what this means is based on the type of pasture and the type of livestock that you're running, that it's being stocked properly. For native pasture land, we require that there be 1 animal unit per 7 to 12 acres. And for improved pasture land, 1 animal unit per 5 to 7 acres. And some examples of an animal unit is 1 full-grown cow, or 1 full-grown horse, or 6 goats. So you would just take your acreage and then divide it by the acres for either native or improved, and that would give you the approximate number of animal units you would need to have on your property. Hay production qualifies for your property. Only pasture that is actually able to produce hay qualifies. Unfortunately, I do have people that try to apply with a pasture full of woods and say they're baling hay off of it. So unfortunately, just the land that's producing the hay would qualify. Basically, we look at that the land is able to produce 1 to 2 round bales or 20 to 40 square bales per acre, and that you're getting about 1 to 2 cuttings per year. Another activity that qualifies is poultry production, but this is going to be your your large broiler and laying houses. Around here, typically it's through Sanderson Farms. Those buildings are typically 20 to 25,000 square feet. Each house will qualify as 10 acres for the agricultural valuation, as that is also a requirement by Sanderson Farms that 10 acres is devoted to each poultry house. A recent agricultural activity that's become popular here in the county is beekeeping. And the state has set up requirements for beekeeping that a property owner has to have a minimum of 5 acres, but a maximum of 20 can be devoted to beekeeping. And then depending on the acreage, you have to have a certain amount of colonies, ranging from 6 up to 12. Another activity that qualifies would be for orchards. And this slide here shows what's typical for Freestone County, mainly peaches, pecans, grapes. And then we have certain requirements for the spacing of each of those, how many trees you have to have per acre. Each one has to have a minimum acreage and the expected yield. And then there's different requirements, whether you have it irrigated or if you're just having it on dry land. All right, and so that was for agricultural valuation. Then we're going to move on to timber valuation, which is a separate application. When we're looking at timber, just like with ag, the primary use has to be timber management, and with the intent to produce income through the harvesting of the timber on the property. In addition to the application, we require a timber management plan. Some people go through a private forester and work with them to develop a plan, or I would direct people to the Texas A&M Forest Service. They have an office out of Palestine, really good people over there. I've got their phone number here on the slide if you would like to contact them, and they would help you develop a management plan for the timber on your property. And just, typical practices for timber management, there'd be some cleaning and clearing. Typically you'd have to do some thinning, and then, full on when it's time to harvest, and then replant. And so the management plan that they develop is specific for your property. They identify the types of trees, and the best practices for managing your property for that timber production. And finally, we get to wildlife valuation. The kicker for this one is that in order to qualify, it has to already be under either the agricultural valuation or the timber valuation the previous year. It also has a minimum acreage requirement of 12.5 acres, unless you are part of a wildlife management co-op or an association, then the minimum is dropped down to 10 acres. In addition to the application, we require that you create a wildlife management plan, which I believe is what we'll be talking about later this evening. And the requirements for the wildlife, you have to be performing at least 3 out of the 7 main activities that are classified. You have your habitat control, erosion control, predator control, providing supplemental food and water, providing shelter, and then performing census counts. That was a brief explanation of our requirements for each of the 3 special valuations for your property. Again, I am the agricultural appraiser here in Freestone County. You can give me a call at 903-389-5510, and my extension is 217, or you can drop me an email at jason.moore@freestonecad.org. Please feel free to contact me anytime. I'm happy to answer any questions, help fill out the application, or answer any questions on the anything else related to the agricultural valuations. Be happy to take any questions. If not, that'll be it.
So if you have any questions, you can either type them in the text chat, or else you can unmute your mic and ask a question. But I do have a question. I mean, I know the answer, but I'm going to ask the question just because I think everyone needs to hear it. If people are applying for the 1D1 exemption for agriculture or whichever, what is the deadline that those applications need to be turned in by?
The deadline is April 30th. We do accept applications after April 30th, but there is a 10% late penalty applied. And then those are accepted to typically mid-July.
This is Bud Black. I'm going to jump in here with Jason on this, because one thing that property owners need to be aware of when they're filing those applications is that the door shuts once the ARB has approved the appraisal records, which is in mid-July, as Jason said. We're prohibited by the property tax code from accepting any late applications for this year. So, you know, as Jason said, mid-July is the drop dead date. And then, you know, come the 1st of August, there's no way that we can apply ag, and the tax code is very clear on that. It's one of the few things that the tax code is extremely clear on, but it is very clear that you can't apply for ag after the ARB has approved the records. And another thing I want to add to what Jason said, because he did talk about the things that are typical to Freestone County, but there are other agricultural activities that people can participate in and still qualify for the special valuation. Now, our intensity standards don't really have any guidance for that right now, because they're not things that are typical to Freestone County. But you can also get the ag value 1D1 valuation for floriculture or horticulture, and for fish, and for like truck farms. But again, they're supposed to be, the key word to that is that an agricultural operation has to be something that a prudent manager would do. In other words, token activity, as he mentioned earlier, it's not going to qualify as something for the special valuation. You can't have one cow on 100 acres and it qualify for ag. You can't have one pecan tree in your backyard and qualify for as an orchard. So there are some requirements to go in there for intensity, but there are some additional things that are agricultural activities that you can get the special valuation for. It might require a little bit of research on our part, but again, the things that he's talked about tonight, and he's done a very good job of explaining everything. And those are the things that are typical to Freestone County. Again, contact Jason and me at the same number if you want to talk to me, and I'll be glad to help you out as well. And we want to thank you all for giving us opportunity to visit with you tonight, and we're certainly most helpful to help you out anytime.
Great, thank you guys so much. Richard, do you want to introduce your next speaker?
Well, let's see if there's any other
Oh,
questions.
any more questions? Yes.
And I will say that I know that that Bud and Jason have talked about Freestone County. I will say that in working with the Leon County Appraisal District, their guidelines, I mean, their animal unit numbers, and it's very, very similar. So even though what they have talked about is specific for Freestone County, it's very, very similar in Leon County as well. So do realize there might be some slight differences as far as stocking rate or something like that. But for the most part, the numbers that were given were very, very or close to what would happen in Leon County. And I've got one other question for the guys, because I know this is a question that I get quite frequently. What's the small? I mean, I know it all depends upon the intensity of how the property is used. But what's the smallest size of property that a person could realistically apply for the 1D1 exemption with?
For just straight the agricultural valuation, like you said, it really depends. We don't have a set minimum. I look at each one individually, the way property's broken out, somebody could own 5 acres next to 100 acres and they only have their house fenced off and the rest is being used by their neighbor that has the 100 acres. And so, that would qualify. We're looking at, how the land is being used, making sure that it is its primary use. And so it's, like I said, it really depends. If you only got an acre and you got a hobby horse out back, no, that's not going to qualify. But like I said, it just depends. And, we review and inspect each one. So for straight ag valuation, we don't have a set minimum. Wildlife, like we said, was 12.5 acres or 10 if you're in a co-op or an association. And then timber, we typically stay around that same acreage. It's looking at whatever is going to be what a logging company is going to want to mess with. So that's what we have for those.
All right. Well, if anybody else comes up with some questions in regards to an ag exemption, I think there'll be some time at the end where you can certainly ask those questions. At this time, we're going to turn the program over to Mason Conley. Mason is a wildlife biologist with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. And I know that one of the common questions that I get in Leon County is people say, well, I've got land and it's got the 1D1 exemption for agriculture. I want to convert that into wildlife. What do I need to do? Well, Mason has worked with a lot of those people, and he's going to kind of outline the steps that need to be taken in order to convert a land or convert property from that ag exemption to wildlife. So Mason, we appreciate you joining us this evening.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Okay, good deal. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Let's get that going. Okay, so this is kind of, everybody got it?
Yes.
Yeah, we see.
Yes.
Okay, good
Yep.
deal. Okay, so this is kind of step one, getting the 1D1 form. Just kind of follow my mouse here. What I do when I meet with people is I start going through this form, really. I normally let the landowner handle part one. That's all their business. Really where I start coming into play is this part two. Anywhere in Freestone and Leon counties, you're going to run it. We're going to be in the Post Oak Savanna ecoregion. So that is step one, pretty much. And then you get down some of these habitat types and amount of acreages. All they're asking for is you have X amount of native range or X amount of pasture, grassland, or timberlands, and you just fill that out, check the box and go. Leon, Freestone County, not much difference. We're all managing for deer. If we could ever have a turkey and quail come through, I'd be ecstatic. But at this point, we're not quite there yet. There's a lot of different things we can do. We can manage things for songbirds, we can manage things for waterfowl, and we can manage for dove. Super specific things when you start getting into kind of reptiles, small mammals, and bats. There's some things specific to bats, but most your general plan is going to be deer. You can look at waterfowl if you've got some ponds, creeks, bigger lakes. And then we can always do things for songbirds and doves as well. We'll move on down. The management plan, goals and objectives. You can be as, I do recommend being as specific as you can. But I typically go with something along the lines of optimizing my property for wildlife habitat or for native wildlife habitat, something along those lines. Again, be as specific as you'd like. Moving on down to this part 5, we're going to come back to this here at the end, but these, what Mr. Moore mentioned, those 7 major practices, 7 major headings, you've got to hit at least 3 of these. A minimum of 3 practices are required. And again, we're going to get each one of these: habitat control, erosion, and so on. They have multiple practices within them. So we're going to come back to this box. Moving on down, is hunting to be a part of this wildlife management plan? Most of the properties I visit probably is some form or fashion. A lot of them aren't. If you are, check what type of hunting. We'll say yes. What type of hunting you got? So we'll say family and guests only. This is pretty self-explanatory right here. 2018, 2019, fill out what you shot, what you harvested. Below that, your population management goals. We love to have 10 acres per deer. A lot of places it's higher than that. So 7, 8 acres per deer. Some places it's lower than that, reaches back to 15. And it really just depends on what your habitat type is. River bottom is typically going to be a little bit higher. Your target sex ratio, we love to hit 2 does per buck, but it's a long stretch. 3 to 1 is good too. If you ever get in the weird situation where you're dipping down below point, a doe per buck, typically you'll see that in high fences sometimes. What you're going to get, a lot of broken antlers, a lot of fighting going on. So we're going to shoot for 2 to 1. Your target production of fawns and does, let's try and get, a fawn for every 2 does or so. So almost a half a fawn per doe. I know it looks funny in that phrasing. Down here, your deer harvest strategies, really I typically say control your density with doe and then focus on your more mature deer, your more mature bucks. And then this is pretty self-explanatory. If you and several members of your neighbors are working together, you can check yes. If you're not, then you're probably not in a co-op. So we'll just leave that, put it at no. And then the same thing below that, Wildlife Property Association, be kind of similar. So we'll just stick with no. If you were, obviously you put your name. We've got a couple in Leon County that work pretty closely together. Moving on back to those 7 things I was talking about. The first one is habitat control. If you've got cattle on your property, yes, you can manage wildlife and cattle. They've come through the system traditionally together, whether it be bison or cattle, whatever it was. So we can manage cattle and wildlife together. It just has to be done the right way. You'll see a lot of this 1 herd, 3, 4 pasture, or multiple pastures. That's pretty self-explanatory. Are you rotating your cattle throughout certain pastures, letting some of the grasslands rest? If you have specific questions about grazing management, feel free to ask in the chat or at the end. But these are all just different types of grazing. Prescribed burning, I can't recommend that enough. One of the best things we could do for our landscape is include prescribed fire, include prescribed burning, get it back on the landscape. Between grazing and fire, that's what a lot of times kept our woodlands in check from Yopon encroachment. Yopon is native, just not in the amounts that we have. So prescribed burning will kind of help keep that in check. Again, just under that is pretty self-explanatory. Your range enhancement and range reseeding. For me, in my world, we have a thing called the Pastures for Upland Birds program. It converts Bermuda, it's improved pasture, basically converting Bermuda grass, Bahia grass, or Johnson grass back to native seeds, back to native grasslands and flowering species. And this is what a lot of that plays in and comes into play. Just going to be asking what kind of acres or how many acres you're seeding, the date to be seeded. And again, what we use a no-till drill, so it'd be drilled if we were doing it. And I range enhancement, range reseeding, I definitely suggest native if you could. As far as wildlife goes, native is going to be your way to go. Moving on down, brush management. This is always a favorite here. We love to do some brush management. Any Yopon you see on your property, unless that's all you have, which I bet my paycheck is probably not all you have. You've probably got some oak and hickories and elms and different things along the creeks and mixed in with it. Get rid of some Yopon. Best way to get rid of it, not the cheapest, is definitely a mulcher followed by some herbicide and then potentially a fire. But within this, pretty common thing you'll see, if you're mowing it to maintain it, you click on the brush hog. hand cutting, kind of a selective hand cutting. You see a lot of dozer work. The only thing I don't like about dozers is it removes a lot of the topsoil and you lose a lot of that beneficial soil for plant growth. We see a lot of hand cutting with a chainsaw, just going in and removing half an acre, whatever it may be. So that'd be what you check there. Really focus on Yopon if you could. If you're going to use a chemical, I'd suggest Remedy Ultra. That's one of your better. Anything with triclopyr as the active ingredient. Coming on down, they're going to ask how you're doing it. If you're doing it in a square block, an acre at a time, 5 acres at a time, whatever it is, check that. Fill in your width, fill in your lengths. If you're going to do it in strips, it's self-explanatory as well. Mosaic, I call a mosaic kind of that selective hand cutting. We're picking and choosing what we're cutting. That kind of covers brush management. That's always one to go after right there. If you have the time and resources and energy, cut some Yopon, please do it. Again, it's native, just not in this amount. Fence modification, the only thing I ever see here really is if you're replacing net wire with a barbed wire. The only thing net wire, yes, it serves a function keeping some hogs out, but if you're looking at deer, which is one of our main species we manage for here, it impedes fawn movement specifically. So does can jump across, the fawns can't. So that's one of the things you do. And again, that's going to be talking with your tax office if it's specific to pronghorn and bighorn. You know, this covers the whole state, not just East Texas, Central Texas. So this form is used for all of Texas. We have to keep that in mind when we're looking at it. Moving on down, riparian just means kind of a creek zone or river bottom area along a creek. So if you did any of that, if you've got livestock on it and you removed it, you check this, complete fencing or partial. If you remove cattle altogether, you know, it's kind of self-explanatory there. Any vegetation you would be going, any vegetation you'd establish, you know, again, trees, shrubs, herbaceous species, herbaceous just being kind of broadleaf plants. We do get some wetland enhancement in Leon County. I'm not as familiar with Freestone, but Leon does a good bit of it. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of funding through some of our private NGOs, non-government organizations, but we're getting back to it. So any of that, you know, that's specifically for waterfowl, for ducks, for shorebirds. Move on down through this. And really, I'm going to hit the highlights, hit the high points of what I see a lot in Leon County, things I deal with. We'll move on out of habitat control. The biggest one in habitat control, again, would be grazing management, prescribed burning, range enhancement and reseeding, and especially brush management. Knock out some Yopon, please. Erosion control. So again, we're going into another major heading. Any ponds you construct or repair, I personally don't know how long that lasts. That would be a question for Jason or one of the appraisal guys or one of those guys to ask how long that lasts. And again, I want to assume some of that kind of lasts a little bit longer than a year, but I'm not sure. The biggest ones I see that I get to work with are pond construction or repair, or really dike and levee construction and management, either reshaping it, repairing it, getting some vegetation on these levees, trying to get something to hold that water. And then kind of going back to the wetland management stuff, you can start looking at water control structures. And then again, water diversions. We get a lot of runoff from some of these hills. Adding in a ridge or revegetating things, that's also pretty popular as well. If you can, go native if you can. I know it's sometimes harder to get those native plants to grow. They will put down roots much deeper than anything than any other non-native species is going to typically, and so they'll make it during a drought either way. I see erosion control probably the least when we start getting into the wildlife tax evaluation. Predator control. This is a huge one. Everybody's trying to get rid of these guys right here. Feral hogs. Big one on here. Method of control. Most people have trapping. Everybody's shooting them for the most part. Trapping. You know, if you could, it's best to get them at the sounder level, picking off one pig here, one pig there. That's really an uphill battle. You know, we're just to maintain the numbers we're at, we're trying to shoot or trap 8 out of every 10 pigs that may come into a feeder. So you start looking at that, the landscape scale, we've got a lot of catching up to do. You can always mix in people. A lot of people target coyotes, raccoons, skunks, bobcats, and Lord have mercy, if we ever get a mountain lion come through, look out. I know it happened close. So that's something to keep in mind. This is always an easy one to target. One thing I will suggest, keep you a harvest log of everything you harvest on the property or trap. Keep a tally running and do it by year. Just it'll save some heartache down the road. And it's always good to have just a log of what's actually occurring on the property, whether it be from a management standpoint or a tax standpoint. It's just good to have, really. Looking at fire ants, definitely pastures. That's something to target. Cowbirds and grackles, I normally don't worry too much with them. That kind of gets into the weeds with some different things. But definitely this line right here, your big six. Trapping and shooting feral hogs especially. Supplemental water, again, kind of going back to that wetland established green tree reservoirs. That'd be kind of flooded timber. If you're big into waterfowl or duck hunting, you see a lot of that. Shallow roost pond development, a lot of wood ducks will use that, especially in a seasonal aspect, but they'll also use it for nesting. Wood ducks will use it for raising their brood. If you're flooding, I mean, all this is pretty self-explanatory. It's basically if you're flooding something, you could check probably one of these as well. Moving on down, one thing you can do, if you've got cattle on the property, you've probably got a water well or trough set up. And so it's just kind of going through here, picking out what you got, whether it be a trough of some site, whatever it may be. You can look at it and pick, and this is pretty self-explanatory here, but that's if you're adding water onto the property. If you do add a trough, one thing I will recommend for wildlife, take you some chicken wire or some type of small net wire and run it over the side of it. We see a lot further west, sometimes we'll see some quail or different kind of birds. You'll get mice or lizards or something kind of reach down to get some water, fall in and can't get back out. This allows them to swim around, jump on that wire and crawl back out. It just saves you some heartache and saves you some digging out some dead animals from your trough. That's one idea to throw at a trough. I think that's pretty good for supplemental water. Moving on down to food. This is, if you're hunting deer, it seems like in Texas we're doing something along that in here in some form or fashion, deer and hogs. You can use supplemental food with your cattle. Having a good rotational grazing, you can make that work. Prescribed burning, again, I can't preach that enough. It will count for this as well. And the habitat control as well as supplemental food. Range enhancement, that kind of goes back to habitat control as well. Food plots, I'd love to see some food plots if you can. Yes, fence them out because hogs are going to get in them. Just type in your size, what you got. Irrigated, yes or no, doesn't, that's kind of up to you. From a food plot standpoint, we do a lot of wheat and oats and rye, and that's all great for a cool season crop. If you want to mix in some clovers as well, or some Austrian winter peas, that's always good. Your warm season crops, any kind of pea, really, iron and clay pea. You can get away with some buckwheat. There's all kinds of crops you could list for a warm season annual crop. What I recommend, go to your local food store or food store, your local feed store, there we go, or co-op, and they'll have chances are they're going to have what's being planted locally for a food plot. You can just ask them and they'll probably be able to guide you in the right direction. But again, any kind of pea is pretty good for your summer. Vetch is good as well, and a lot of your clover species will do well in the spring as well. Moving on down, feeders and mineral supplementation. Everybody in the world's got a feeder, so you can use them for a dual purpose. We're going to use it for supplementing type of species and harvesting. If you see me type in WTD, that's going to be white-tailed deer. We're targeting deer. We're also going to target some songbirds because they will benefit from things we're doing. And we'll also look at dove. Anytime you walk up to a feeder, a lot of times the first thing that's going to fly off is some dove. So what I recommend a lot of times for your deer, don't just run corn. Corn's like ice cream to us, and we all know what happens if we eat nothing but ice cream. So mix in corn if you can afford it. Throw in some protein. The high fence setting, you're going to see more benefits from protein. On a low fence setting, they will get some nutrition from it, but it's not enough to make a difference at a smaller acreage size. So anyway, throw in some protein if you can. But when we're looking at songbirds and dove, throw in some milo or some chicken scratch. A lot of that grain and small seed is going to be beneficial to songbirds and dove. They're going to stop by and they're going to check it out. Now, let me say this. Don't shoot your dove over your feeder with that milo and chicken scratch in it. You're going to have a headache with the game warden. So just be mindful of that. But that is something we can do to turn these feeders into beneficial food sources for other species other than this deer and let's say pigs. Your feeder type, typically it's a time sling. If it's not, it's a gravity. So whatever is specific to you, go for it. Your mineral type, I typically just say block. Your number of feeders, depending on your property size. If it's 100 acres, I'd say, 4 or 5 feeders is plenty. And I want to say the tax office has a number that they hit, but again, that's on their side. For let's say a 60 acre property, 50 acre property, 2 or 3 is plenty. You can get away with 4, so 2 to 4, sure. And that's for your time sling or your gravity feeders. Your method of mineral dispensing, just put it on the ground. Put your block on the ground. Let it stay there. When it runs out, fill it back up or put another one down. Leave it on the ground year round. These deer, wildlife will need certain minerals throughout the year. Managing tame pastures. So if you are going out and disking and mowing, and this is really more beneficial further west, but here if we disc or mow, or disc, we're probably going to get some goat weed come back. That's good for dove, but not much else. So mowing and shredding is your best periodic disturbance in this category. If you're reseeding anything, I definitely recommend that no-till would be best for us. Really in this section, your food plots, your feeders and mineral blocks are your 2 best practices to shoot for. Supplemental shelter, I promise you we've all got this in spades and you just may not realize it. One easy thing to do, get you some nest boxes. If you've got a pond, a creek, a bigger lake, we're going to target some wood ducks, and you can find pre-made wood duck boxes. You can find them on Amazon, wherever you want to look, or Ducks Unlimited actually has some good specs to make your own. Another thing you can do, buy you some bird houses, put them out on your pastures, kind of on a tree on the edge of your pastures, and we're going to target eastern bluebirds. That's what we're going to be shooting for there. You'll probably get other cavity nesting birds, some tufted titmice, whatever it may be. We used to have screech owls nest in our wood duck boxes, but something will use it. Going back to that first early heading when we were checking what we're managing for, bats were an option. Bat boxes you can do. I've got a lady in Leon County that she has hundreds using a couple bat boxes. Pretty neat to see. But our wood duck boxes, our eastern bluebird boxes, these are cavity type. And then again, you just fill in how many you got. You can't really go too few, but if I've got 50 acres, I'm looking at probably 5 or 6 or so. And again, there's probably some sort of minimum for each county. Moving on down, probably all got a brush pile on the property. So mark up your brush, leave your brush piles. It's good for small mammals, good for insects, good for birds, good for rabbits, good for a lot of different things. Check it out to see what your number per acre is going to be. That's something they're going to want to know. If you cut any limbs, if you cut any tree limbs, I know we've got a lot of pine limbs just hanging right now from this recent freeze. That's slash. That's all that is. Cut it and leave it laying if you can, if it's not in your way. Again, that's good for a lot of different smaller species. This fence line management, typically don't mess with it too much. We've got enough yopon on our fences or cedar that we don't really mess with. And I just said cedar. Let's go back up to that brush management or habitat control. Now that I've said cedar, let's put that in there as well. Get rid of some cedar. From a wildlife perspective, it doesn't do much at all. Moving on, so cedar and yopon, if you can lose it, it's not hurting my feelings any. Moving on down back to supplemental shelters, we got nest boxes, wood ducks, and eastern bluebirds. Brush piles, brush piles, leaving them. Down here, what I recommend, if you've got some pastures, they're going to want to know how many acres you're looking at messing with. And then, so what I do is I look at deferred mowing here. A lot of times, your doe will lay the fawns down in some taller grasses, and that's what they need during that time frame. So anywhere from May to, let's just give it a long stretch to July. Let's leave some of those grasses taller if we can. And 1 other acres. So again, if you can leave it high, please do. It'll help the fawns out tremendously. You'll see should see a higher fawn rate. If you're mowing, we can throw that mix in as well. If you're not, if you're planning on mowing, don't use that one. But if you're going to mow for supplemental shelter, it counts somehow. But acres mowed annually, they're going to want to know that as well. So just keep that in mind. This part of the world, we really don't have cut trees or shrubs. That's something we see with a lot of mesquite further west and more central Texas, good for quail habitat. If you're planting trees, again, you're going to select this. If it's a block style, if it's kind of here and there, it's going to be your mosaic strips. Again, this is fairly self-explanatory. One thing I know we've all got on our property is some dead trees standing. Now, one thing I will recommend, if it's not in danger of falling on you or somebody visiting your property, leave it. If it's not on a trail, if it's not by a feeder or a stand or your house or something along those lines, leave it. It's great for forest health, and a lot of different animals will use these, what we call snags. It's just a dead standing tree. What I do is I'll kind of, I don't get real specific with what kind of oak or what kind of pine it is. I just say an oak or a pine species. Size of the snag, if you can leave 10 to 20 feet, great. And again, just looking at your number per acre. So seeing how many, kind of estimating what you've got on your property and extrapolating that out. So that gives us supplemental shelter in spades. We've got plenty there. Moving on into the last section of census, things you can do. Spotlight counts are good in more open settings. A lot of our woodland areas are choked out with yaupons, so I don't really recommend spotlight counts here unless you've got good visibility. You're going to know your length, your visibility, which if you ever want to do it, just contact your local biologist and we can get you all set up with visibility and different measurements for it. In that, you're obviously targeting deer. One thing you can do, what I recommend for even all the properties I work with, keep a log book in your car or in your UTV, whatever it may be, and just write down what you see. Write down what deer you see. I typically keep this at an annual setting. So whenever you're out working on the land, you drive up and you see some deer, and a lot of times I'll say keep it. My spelling is rough today. Just keep it weekly, because you'll see that a lot of times you'll see the same 5 doe over and over and over and over again. So keep it on a weekly basis if you can. Okay. So if you've got I do recommend keeping a log in your blinds so you know what deer you're seeing. I'm seeing X amount of bucks at this time on this date, X amount of doe. So really the 2 biggest ones, I say keep a log in your vehicle, your UTV, and in your blinds. You can do stand counts. There's some science behind it. Again, contact your local biologist. We'd be more than happy to help. One thing you can always do, keep some measurements of deer you harvest. You can learn how to age deer by the jawbone. It's not too difficult. If we can do it, anybody can. If you got a scale, weigh it. We can always tell buck or doe. You can always do some crude antler data, inside spread. You got to know that for the game warden anyway. So inside spread, left, right points, maybe a main beam or something along those lines, and keep you up to your harvest date. Again, this goes back to that harvest log. Brow surveys are a little bit more into it, but if you're running game cameras on your feeder or on a corn pile, one thing you can do is come down here to remote detection. And there's some protocol with it. There's some science behind it. Again, we're targeting white-tailed deer, and any of your local biologists would be more than happy to send you the protocol and get you on your ground, on your feet running with doing some of these camera surveys. So if we go all the way back to this top section where they were asking what kind of things were you doing on your property, what headings could you hit? Yaupon cedar control, you can check that. Hogs, coyotes, bobcats, whatever it may be, you can check that. If you've got a well or trough, check that. Supplemental food, we've all got that. Check that. You've got shelters, you've got dead standing trees, you've got nest boxes. And again, do some counting, keep up with a harvest log, and that'll allow you to check that. So out of that, you've got 6 out of 7. Chances are most properties won't have water. So chances are you're already doing 5 out of the 7 minimum practices, or 5 out of 7 practices with a minimum of 3. So if you have any questions, throw them in the chat or talk to me afterwards. I'd be happy to help. Again, I'm in Leon County, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions or needing assistance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mason. Does anybody have any questions for Mason in regards to wildlife management, filling out the form for conversion to wild? Well, Mason, I do have a question for you. I know we've got some people on from Freestone County. Do you know the contact, or do you know who your counterpart is there in Freestone County?
Yes, I do. Taylor Garrison is in Freestone County. And yeah, so what I would recommend, just type in Taylor Garrison TPWD, and it'll be the first thing that pops up when in your search engine. But yes, sir, he offices out of, he's got several counties. Let me say this: he offices out of the Richland Creek WMA, and but he covers Freestone County. Yes, sir.
Any other questions for Mason at this time? Oh, there's one that just came up in the chat. Does this paperwork have to be turned in every year, or is it good for 5 years?
So the plan, my understanding, you do the plan, then you'll get an annual report sent to you. And what that annual report is going to leave, it's going to leave out a lot of this early background information. It's going to pretty much pick up at habitat control and run through your census counts. I want to say plans are good. So I work with Grimes County as well. Let me say that, and their plans are good for 5 years. And then I don't know that they send an annual report out every year. That's going to be kind of maybe a question for Jason, how often they check up. But again, there is an annual report that will get sent to you at some time.
Yeah, Jason here. Yeah, we require this plan that you went over for the application, and then as you mentioned, the annual one is slightly different. It's mainly the same, but for Freestone County, we do require the annual update every year. We send those out around the end of the year, first of the year, for people to fill out and update us on their management activities, and then to send those back to us.
Another question that came through the chat box was, do they, and I'm assuming when you say they, is that the appraisal district, come out and inspect the property after the wildlife application has been filed?
That's on a case-by-case basis. Once I get the application in and process it, I do a lot of reviewing by aerial photography. And then just based on the application and what's in the management plan, if I feel the need to do an on-site inspection, I'll be in contact to set up a time to come out and meet and to review what you're doing on your property. So yeah, like I said, if I feel the need to, I will be in contact to set up a time for an inspection. Because for something like wildlife management, that's going to be, I would have to meet the property owner there, and they would have to show me around, given the activities that are for wildlife.
Any other questions regards to wildlife, or regarding ag exemption or timber exemptions, exemptions in general? Well, Aaron, I'm going to turn it over to you then, so you can kind of tell people about the survey. So Aaron, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, Mason, Bud, and Jason again for speaking this evening and providing all that information. I posted in the chat, and I will post it again, the link to the Qualtrics survey. I mean, it's just 5 questions. If you could fill that out now, or Richard and I will follow up with an email with that link as well. So just fill that out. And don't forget about our April 20th program that'll be on lease agreements. I can't really think of any other housekeeping deals, but thank you everyone for being here. And please complete the survey.
Whenever we send the reminder about the survey, we'll send you an email about that. We'll also send you information on the April program as well.
Yes.
All righty. Well,
Alrighty.
and I guess that's it. So thank you once again to our speakers. We hope that you as participants were able to get some beneficial information out of this evening's program. And remember, if you are applying for that exemption or that 1D1 exemption on your property, April 25th is the deadline. So you've got about a month to get all your ducks in a row. And we appreciate each and every one of you for joining us this evening. So y'all have a good evening. And as Aaron said, we hope to see you in April.